A janitor's split-second decision at 2:47 a.m. exposed a $50 million murder conspiracy and proved that the most powerless person in the room can change everything when they refuse to stay silent. What Marcus Washington discovered in Chicago's most elite hospital will shatter everything you believe about who really protects us when money and power decide that some lives don't matter. This isn't just a story about one man's courage. It's about how a single act of defiance can topple an empire built on lies and transform a broken system from the inside out. If you've ever felt invisible, ever wondered if your voice matters when nobody seems to be listening, this story will remind you why every conscience has the power to change the world. Hit that like button if you believe ordinary heroes can do extraordinary things. Subscribe because stories like this need to be heard. And comment below about a time when you chose to speak up when others stayed silent, because your courage might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. A janitor with a medical degree made a discovery at 2:47 a.m. that would expose a conspiracy worth $50 million and prove that sometimes the most overlooked person in the room sees what everyone else misses. What Marcus Washington found in the VIP wing of Chicago's most prestigious hospital will make you question everything you think you know about who really protects patients when the system fails them. Marcus Washington walked the sterile corridors of Northwestern Memorial Hospital like a ghost in blue scrubs, invisible to the doctors who rushed past him, unnoticed by the nurses who barely acknowledged his presence, and completely dismissed by the administrators who saw him as nothing more than another piece of maintenance equipment. At 34, Marcus carried himself with quiet dignity that most people never bothered to recognize, his 6-foot frame moving efficiently through the hospital's gleaming halls as he pushed his cleaning cart from room to room during the lonely night shift. But what nobody knew, what nobody cared to discover, was that beneath that janitor's uniform beat the heart of someone who had once dreamed of wearing a white coat instead of carrying a mop. Marcus Washington had been 3 months away from graduating medical school when his world collapsed. His mother's cancer diagnosis, his father's job loss, and crushing student loans had forced him to make an impossible choice between his dreams and his family's survival. He chose family, dropped out, and took the only job that would hire him immediately. That was 8 years ago, and every night since then, he'd walk these halls with medical knowledge that could rival most residents, watching, observing, understanding things that others missed because they never bothered to look at the man pushing the cleaning cart. Tonight felt different, though. As Marcus approached the VIP wing, where Chicago's elite received their private care, something in the air seemed heavier, more charged with tension. The VIP suite at the end of the corridor was usually empty by this hour, but tonight security guards flanked the door, their faces stone-cold serious, their posture rigid with the kind of attention that only came with high-profile cases. Marcus had seen this before. When someone important died, especially someone whose death might raise questions, the hospital turned into a fortress of protocol and procedure. He nodded respectfully to the guards as he always did, received their usual dismissive glances in return, and continued his work, cleaning the adjacent rooms while his trained ear picked up fragments of hushed conversations about insurance policies, suspicious circumstances, and a grieving widower worth billions. The guards eventually left around 2:30 a.m., satisfied that the scene was secure and the paperwork properly filed. Marcus waited 15 minutes, following his usual routine of cleaning the corridor before entering the VIP suite. He knocked gently on the door out of habit, received no response as expected, and entered the darkened room with his cart. The sight that greeted him stopped him cold. On the hospital bed lay Sarah Catherine Pemberton, 29 years old, breathtakingly beautiful even in death, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spun gold, her face peaceful but somehow wrong in a way that made Marcus's medical instincts scream in alarm. According to the chart hanging at the foot of her bed, she had suffered a massive heart attack at her Lake Forest mansion and been pronounced dead on arrival 3 hours earlier. Her husband, tech billionaire David Pemberton, had reportedly been devastated, making all the arrangements for a private autopsy and immediate cremation. But as Marcus approached the bed to begin his cleaning routine, something made him pause. Sarah's skin, while pale, wasn't the waxy gray he'd learned to associate with death during his medical training. There was still a subtle warmth radiating from her body, and when he looked closer, He could swear he saw the faintest rise and fall of her chest. His heart began pounding as 8 years of suppressed medical knowledge surged to the surface. And Marcus Washington realized he was looking at something that wasn't death at all, but something far more sinister that someone had gone to great lengths to disguise as natural causes. What Marcus discovered next would transform him from invisible janitor to the only person standing between life and death. But no one could have predicted the price he would pay for trusting his instincts over official paperwork. As he stood frozen beside Sarah Pemberton's bed, his medical training kicked into overdrive, analyzing every detail that the emergency room doctors had apparently missed or chosen to ignore. Her lips held the faintest hint of pink instead of the blue-gray pallor of genuine cardiac arrest. Her fingernails showed no signs of cyanosis, the telltale blue tinge that appears when the heart stops pumping oxygen-rich blood. Most telling of all, when Marcus gently lifted her eyelid, her pupil contracted slightly in response to the overhead light, a reflex that should have been impossible if she were truly dead. Every instinct screamed that this woman was alive, trapped in some kind of chemically induced state that mimicked death so perfectly that even trained medical professionals had been fooled. Marcus felt his hands trembling as the full implications hit him. If Sarah Pemberton was alive and scheduled for cremation in less than 18 hours, he was looking at something far worse than medical malpractice. He was witnessing attempted murder disguised as natural causes, orchestrated with the kind of precision that only came from someone with intimate knowledge of how the system worked. The weight of responsibility crashed down on his shoulders like an avalanche. He could walk away, finish his cleaning shift, and pretend he never noticed anything unusual. After all, who would believe a janitor over teams of doctors, especially a black janitor, questioning the death of a white billionaire's wife? The safer choice would be to stay invisible, stay silent, and avoid the inevitable consequences of challenging people with more power than he could ever imagine. But as Marcus stared at Sarah's face, he saw something that changed everything. Her eyelids fluttered, barely perceptible but unmistakably real, and in that instant he knew he couldn't live with himself if he walked away. His 8-year-old daughter Keisha flashed through his mind, the little girl who still believed her daddy was a hero, even though he mopped floors instead of saving lives. What kind of man would he be if he let someone die when he had the knowledge and opportunity to save them? Marcus made a decision that would alter the course of multiple lives forever. He dropped to his knees beside the bed, placed his hands on Sarah's chest, and began CPR with the skill and precision of someone who had trained for this moment years ago, but never imagined using it under these circumstances. After 30 seconds of chest compressions, something miraculous happened. Sarah's eyes snapped open, wide with terror and confusion, her mouth gasping for air as her body fought its way back from the chemical prison that had held her captive. She tried to speak but could only manage a hoarse whisper that sent chills down Marcus's spine. "Help me," she breathed, her voice barely audible but crystal clear in its desperation. "They tried to. He tried to." Before she could finish the sentence, the room exploded into chaos as alarms began sounding throughout the VIP wing. Security guards burst through the door, followed immediately by medical staff who had been alerted by the monitoring equipment that had suddenly detected vital signs from a patient who was supposed to be dead. But the person who appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later made Marcus's blood run cold. David Pemberton strode into the room like a man possessed, his face a mask of fury and disbelief as he took in the scene before him. His wife, very much alive, sitting up in bed and looking at her husband with unmistakable fear in her eyes. And Marcus, still kneeling beside the bed, his hands covered in the evidence of having just performed life-saving CPR on a woman the entire hospital believed was beyond help. The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but in those moments Marcus realized that his decision to save Sarah Pemberton's life had just made him the most dangerous person in the room. What happened in the next 60 seconds would prove that saving a life could be the most dangerous thing Marcus had ever done, and the system's response would shock you to your core. David Pemberton's eyes locked onto Marcus with the cold calculation of a predator who had just discovered an unexpected threat to his carefully orchestrated plan. The billionaire's voice cut through the chaos like a blade when he spoke, each word dripping with barely controlled rage and something far more sinister. "What did you do to my wife?" he demanded, his tone suggesting that Marcus had committed some unspeakable act rather than performed a life-saving miracle. The medical staff who had rushed into the room suddenly found themselves caught between their professional obligation to celebrate a patient's recovery and their institutional loyalty to one of the hospital's most powerful benefactors. Dr. Patricia Hamilton, the chief of emergency medicine, stepped forward with the kind of diplomatic caution that came from years of navigating the treacherous waters between medicine and money. "Mr. Pemberton, your wife appears to have been in a state of deep metabolic suppression that mimicked clinical death," she explained carefully, avoiding eye contact with Marcus while speaking. "It's extremely rare, but sometimes patients can present with such reduced vital signs that they appear deceased when they're actually in a catatonic state." But David wasn't interested in medical explanations. His focus remained laser-focused on Marcus, who was still kneeling beside Sarah's bed, his hand protectively placed on her shoulder as she trembled with fear and confusion. "I want to know why this man was alone with my wife," David said, his voice rising to a level that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. "I want to know what he did to her, and I want him arrested immediately for assault." The word assault hung in the air like a poison cloud, transforming Marcus from hero to suspect in a single breath. Security guards who had initially looked at him with confusion now studied him with suspicion, their hands moving instinctively toward their radios as they awaited orders from their superiors. Marcus felt the familiar sting of being judged not by his actions, but by the color of his skin and the uniform he wore. The same prejudice that had followed him through every corridor of this hospital for 8 long years. If you're watching this story and it's making you feel something deep in your chest, something that reminds you of times when you've seen good people punished for doing the right thing, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us about a time when you witnessed injustice firsthand. Your engagement helps us share these important stories with people who need to hear them, and your comments create a community of people who believe that truth matters more than power. Sarah tried to speak, her voice stronger now, but still shaky from whatever chemicals had been used to suppress her system. "He saved me," she whispered, looking directly at her husband, with eyes that held more fear than gratitude. "I was awake. I could hear everything. I couldn't move." But David cut her off with a sharp gesture, his facade of concerned husband slipping just enough to reveal something ugly underneath. "You're confused, darling," he said with false tenderness that made Marcus's skin crawl. "You've been through a terrible trauma. Let the doctors take care of you while we deal with this security breach." The phrase "a security breach" made it clear that David viewed Marcus not as Sarah's savior, but as a threat to be eliminated. Hospital Administrator Janet Cross arrived within minutes, her expression grim as she surveyed the situation that threatened to become a public relations nightmare. Marcus watched helplessly as the narrative began to shift around him, his act of heroism being reframed as a violation of protocol, his medical knowledge dismissed as irrelevant because it wasn't backed by the proper credentials. "Mr. Washington," she said with cold formality, "you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation into this incident. Security will escort you from the premises, and you're not to return until further notice." As 2 guards flanked him, Marcus looked back at Sarah one last time, seeing in her terrified eyes the confirmation that he had done the right thing, even if the world was determined to punish him for it. The system that should have protected both of them was instead preparing to sacrifice him to preserve the reputation of a man whose money mattered more than the truth. But the tragedy was far from over, and what investigators discovered in the next 48 hours would expose a conspiracy so elaborate that it reached into the highest levels of Chicago's medical and financial elite. Detective Maria Rodriguez had seen enough cases of domestic violence disguised as accidents to recognize the warning signs immediately when the Northwestern Memorial incident landed on her desk. A young, beautiful wife who mysteriously dies of heart failure with no prior medical history, a billionaire husband who seems more concerned about controlling the narrative than grieving his loss, and a hospital staff mysteriously eager to rush through cremation procedures without proper investigation. The red flags were so numerous they practically formed a parade. But what made this case different was Marcus Washington, a witness whose medical knowledge couldn't be easily dismissed despite the system's best efforts to silence him. Rodriguez's first breakthrough came when she requested Sarah's complete medical records and discovered something that made her blood run cold. The toxicology report, which should have been standard procedure for any suspicious death, had been mysteriously delayed and then canceled entirely on David Pemberton's direct orders. When she pressed the hospital administration for answers, she was told that the family had requested privacy and that further testing was unnecessary given the clear cause of death. But Rodriguez knew that wealthy families didn't typically refuse toxicology reports unless they had something to hide. And David Pemberton's behavior suggested he was hiding something enormous. She immediately ordered independent blood work from samples that had been preserved during Sarah's initial treatment, and what came back confirmed her worst suspicions. Sarah's system contained traces of a rare paralytic agent called succinylcholine, a drug used in surgical procedures that causes complete muscle paralysis while leaving the victim fully conscious and aware. In the right dosage, it could mimic death so perfectly that even experienced medical professionals might be fooled, especially if they weren't looking for it. But here's what made Rodriguez's discovery truly terrifying. Succinylcholine breaks down rapidly in the human body, usually becoming undetectable within hours of administration. The only reason traces remained in Sarah's blood was because Marcus had revived her so quickly after the drug was administered. If he had waited even 30 minutes longer, the evidence would have vanished completely, and Sarah would have been cremated while still alive, trapped inside her own paralyzed body and unable to scream for help. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Rodriguez received an anonymous tip that led her to Northwestern Memorial's pharmaceutical inventory records. Someone had been systematically stealing small quantities of succinylcholine over the past 6 months, amounts so tiny that they never triggered the hospital's automated alerts, but large enough to create a stockpile sufficient for murder. The thefts corresponded perfectly with David Pemberton's increased visits to the hospital, ostensibly to tour facilities for a potential charitable donation, but Rodriguez now suspected these visits served a much darker purpose. Security footage from those visits had been conveniently erased, but Rodriguez's team managed to recover fragments that showed David meeting privately with Dr. Kevin Morrison, the anesthesiologist who had unrestricted access to the hospital's controlled substances. When Rodriguez brought Dr. Morrison in for questioning, the man crumbled within minutes, his guilt written across his face like a confession letter. Through tears of shame and terror, he revealed the scope of David Pemberton's plan, a scheme so cold-blooded it defied comprehension. David had discovered that Sarah was planning to divorce him and claim half of his fortune, a loss that would have cost him over $1 billion and destroyed his carefully crafted public image. Rather than face the humiliation and financial devastation of a public divorce, David had recruited Morrison to help him stage Sarah's death, promising the debt-ridden doctor $2 million and a position at a prestigious private clinic in exchange for his cooperation. The plan had been executed with surgical precision. Sarah would be given the paralytic agent during what she believed was a routine medical checkup, declared dead from heart failure, and cremated before anyone could discover the truth. But neither David nor Dr. Morrison had accounted for Marcus Washington, a janitor whose medical training and moral courage had shattered their perfect crime. As Rodriguez listened to Morrison's confession, she realized that Marcus hadn't just saved one woman's life. He had prevented a murder so sophisticated that it would have been impossible to solve after the fact. The conspiracy was about to unravel completely, but the most shocking revelations were still to come. What no one expected was how far David Pemberton would go to silence the man who had destroyed his perfect murder, and the next 72 hours would prove that billionaires don't just buy silence, they buy terror. The moment Dr. Morrison's confession reached Detective Rodriguez's desk, David Pemberton transformed from grieving widower to cornered predator, unleashing the full force of his wealth and connections in a desperate attempt to destroy Marcus Washington before the truth could spread any further. Within hours of the confession, Marcus received a call from his daughter's school informing him that 8-year-old Keisha had been approached by strangers asking questions about her father's work schedule and home address. The message was crystal clear. David Pemberton could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. Marcus felt his world crumbling as he realized that his decision to save Sarah's life had painted a target not just on his own back, but on his innocent daughter. The anonymous phone calls began that same night, voices promising that accidents could happen to little girls who walked to school alone, that house fires were tragically common in his neighborhood, and that single fathers sometimes just disappeared without a trace. Each threat was carefully crafted to avoid direct language that could be traced back to David, but the message was unmistakable. Withdraw your statement, disappear quietly, and maybe your family will survive this. But Marcus had underestimated the power of his own story and the community that had been watching his struggle in silence for far too long. The breaking point came when security footage surfaced showing two men in expensive suits sitting in a black sedan outside Keisha's elementary school for 3 consecutive days, taking photographs and making phone calls while watching children play during recess. Detective Rodriguez immediately placed both Marcus and his daughter under police protection. But the damage to Marcus's psyche was already done. He was a man who had spent 8 years invisible, and now suddenly everyone was watching him, some with admiration, but others with deadly intent. The stress began taking its toll as Marcus struggled with panic attacks, sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of knowing that his act of heroism had endangered the only person who mattered more to him than his own life. But then something beautiful happened that David Pemberton never saw coming. The story of Marcus Washington, the janitor who risked everything to save a stranger's life, began spreading through Chicago's African-American community like wildfire. Churches started prayer circles for his protection. His neighbors organized rotating watch schedules to monitor his apartment building. Local news stations picked up the story, and suddenly Marcus wasn't fighting alone anymore. A crowdfunding campaign raised $40,000 for his legal defense in just 2 days. Civil rights attorneys offered their services pro bono. Most importantly, other Northwestern Memorial employees began coming forward, sharing stories of their own encounters with David Pemberton's intimidation tactics and the hospital administration's willingness to look the other way when wealthy donors made unreasonable demands. The community support reached its peak when Reverend James Patterson of Mount Calvary Baptist Church organized a rally outside Northwestern Memorial Hospital, drawing over 300 people who demanded justice for Marcus and accountability from the institution that had tried to sacrifice him to protect a murderer. Signs reading, "Heroes don't wear white coats," and "Janitors save lives too," filled the hospital's entrance plaza as news cameras captured the growing movement. David Pemberton watched the coverage from his Lake Forest mansion, his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse as public opinion turned decisively against him. His legal team advised him to settle quietly and disappear, but David's arrogance wouldn't allow him to accept defeat from a man he considered beneath his notice. That's when David made the mistake that would seal his fate forever. Instead of backing down, he doubled down, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on Marcus's past, bribing hospital board members to change their stories, and even attempting to have Marcus arrested on fabricated drug possession charges. But Detective Rodriguez was watching every move, documenting every illegal act, building a case that would soon make David Pemberton realize that some people can't be bought, threatened, or silenced, and that justice sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. But justice was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible, and what happened in the Cook County Courthouse would prove that sometimes the truth needs a courtroom to finally be heard by the world. 6 months after Marcus Washington saved Sarah Pemberton's life, the case that had captivated Chicago finally reached its climactic moment as David Pemberton sat in the defendant's chair, his billion-dollar empire crumbling around him while the man he had tried to destroy prepared to testify against him. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds gathering outside to watch the proceedings on large screens that local news stations had set up to accommodate the hundreds of people who couldn't get inside. This wasn't just a murder trial anymore. It had become a symbol of whether justice could prevail when ordinary people stood up against extraordinary wealth and power. David's legal team, led by the most expensive criminal defense attorney money could buy, had spent months crafting a strategy designed to destroy Marcus's credibility and paint him as an unstable janitor with delusions of medical expertise. They brought in character witnesses who testified about Marcus's financial struggles, suggesting that he had been paid by Sarah to stage her rescue in an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. They questioned his mental health, his motivations, and even his right to perform CPR without proper medical licensing. But every attack they launched seemed to backfire as the community that had rallied around Marcus filled the courtroom gallery, their presence a constant reminder that this case represented something much larger than one man's alleged crimes. The turning point came when Marcus took the witness stand, his voice steady and clear as he recounted that night in excruciating detail. He described the medical signs that had alerted him to Sarah's condition, explaining each symptom with the precision of someone who had genuinely studied medicine, not someone making up stories for money. He spoke about the moment he realized that walking away would mean allowing someone to be cremated alive, and how his daughter's face had flashed through his mind as he made the decision to act. His testimony was so compelling, so filled with technical accuracy and moral clarity, that even David's attorney seemed shaken by the end of his cross-examination. But the most devastating moment came when the prosecution played security footage that Detective Rodriguez had recovered, showing David meeting secretly with Dr. Morrison in the hospital parking garage just days before Sarah's supposed death, their body language suggesting conspiracy rather than coincidental conversation. Then Sarah herself took the stand, and the courtroom fell into absolute silence as she described the horror of being paralyzed but fully conscious, able to hear the arrangements being made for her cremation while trapped inside her own body. She testified about years of psychological abuse, financial control, and threats that had made her feel like a prisoner in her own marriage. With trembling hands, she held up her phone and played a recording she had secretly made weeks before her planned murder, David's voice clearly audible as he discussed the insurance payout and his plans for a new life with his mistress once his inconvenient wife was permanently out of the picture. The recording was so damning, so coldly calculating, that several jurors visibly recoiled in shock and disgust. David's defense crumbled completely when FBI agents testified about the elaborate money trail they had uncovered, showing payments to Dr. Morrison, attempts to bribe hospital officials, and even evidence of David hiring private investigators to intimidate witnesses. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict: guilty on all counts of attempted murder, conspiracy, witness intimidation, and racketeering. As the judge sentenced David Pemberton to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the courtroom erupted in cheers and tears of relief. Marcus sat quietly in the gallery, holding his daughter's hand, finally vindicated after months of being treated like a criminal for having the courage to save a life. But even as justice was served, everyone in that courtroom knew that this case had changed something fundamental about how society viewed the people it had always chosen to ignore. What nobody could have predicted was how one man's act of courage would transform not just his own life, but an entire system that had operated in the shadows for far too long. 1 year after David Pemberton was sentenced to life in prison, Marcus Washington stood in the East Wing of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, no longer pushing a cleaning cart but wearing a crisp navy suit with a badge that read, Director of Patient Advocacy. The same corridors where he had once been invisible now echoed with his footsteps, as he led a team of advocates dedicated to ensuring that every patient's voice would be heard, regardless of their race, economic status, or social position. The transformation was so complete that many of the doctors who had once looked through him now sought his counsel on complex cases involving patient rights and medical ethics. The Marcus Washington Foundation had awarded full scholarships to over 100 minority students pursuing medical careers, each recipient chosen not just for their academic excellence, but for their commitment to serving underrepresented communities. Marcus himself had returned to medical school part-time, finally completing the degree that financial hardship had stolen from him years earlier, but he chose to use his medical knowledge in advocacy rather than direct patient care, because he had discovered that his true calling was protecting the vulnerable within the healthcare system. The Foundation's headquarters, located just blocks from the courthouse where justice had finally been served, displayed a simple plaque that read, "Truth doesn't require a title, courage doesn't require credentials." But perhaps the most meaningful transformation belonged to his daughter Keisha, now 9 years old and the recipient of the Presidential Youth Courage Award for her essay about her father's bravery. Standing at the podium in the White House Rose Garden, wearing a bright yellow dress that matched her radiant smile, Keisha spoke with the poise of someone far beyond her years. My daddy taught me that heroes don't always wear capes or have superpowers, she said, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd of dignitaries and media representatives. Sometimes heroes wear janitor uniforms and clean floors at night, but they still know how to save lives because they never stopped caring about people that everybody else forgot about. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes, but Marcus only had eyes for his daughter, tears streaming down his face as he realized that his decision to act with courage had given her a lesson more valuable than any inheritance. Sarah Pemberton, now Sarah Mitchell after reclaiming her maiden name, had used her divorce settlement to establish the largest domestic violence shelter network in the Midwest, helping over 5,000 women escape abusive relationships in just the first year of operation. She and Marcus maintained a friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of how quickly life can change when someone chooses to do the right thing despite the personal cost. She often spoke at his foundation events, reminding audiences that survival sometimes depends on the courage of strangers who refuse to look away when others choose silence. The ripple effects of Marcus's story continued to spread far beyond Chicago as the Marcus Washington Act became federal law, requiring all hospitals to implement mandatory protocols for investigating suspicious deaths and ensuring that all staff members, regardless of their position, had protected channels for reporting concerns about patient safety. Medical schools across the country began incorporating his story into their ethics curricula, using it to teach future doctors about the importance of listening to every voice within the healthcare system. 3 years after that fateful night when he knelt beside Sarah's bed and chose courage over safety, Marcus received a letter from a young nursing student in Atlanta who wrote, "Your story taught me that being right matters more than being popular, and that sometimes the most important medical intervention is performed by someone who cares enough to act when others won't." As Marcus stood in his office one evening, looking out at the city lights of Chicago, he reflected on how a single moment of moral courage had transformed not just his own destiny, but had created waves of positive change that would continue long after his story faded from headlines. He had learned that heroism isn't about having power, it's about using whatever power you have to protect those who have none, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin with one person who refuses to walk away when walking away would be easier. Marcus Washington's story teaches us something profound about the invisible heroes walking among us every single day. In a world that judges worth by titles and bank accounts, Marcus proved that courage doesn't require credentials and that the most important voice in the room might belong to the person everyone else chooses to ignore. His journey from invisible janitor to director of patient advocacy isn't just about one man's triumph. It's about recognizing that every single one of us has the power to see what others miss, to speak when others stay silent, and to act when others turn away. The truth is, we all encounter moments like Marcus faced at 2:47 a.m., moments when we can choose between safety and righteousness, between invisibility and impact. Maybe you won't find someone paralyzed in a hospital bed, but you will find injustice hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to call it by name. Marcus's medical knowledge didn't make him a hero, his janitor's uniform didn't make him powerless, and David Pemberton's billions couldn't make him untouchable. What made the difference was one man's decision to trust his instincts over institutional pressure, to value human life over personal safety, and to remember that being right matters more than being popular. The most beautiful part of this story isn't that Marcus saved Sarah's life, though that was miraculous. It's that his courage created a ripple effect that continues to save lives today through the Marcus Washington Act, through the foundation scholarships, through the advocacy programs, and through every person who heard his story and decided they wouldn't stay silent the next time they witnessed something wrong. When Keisha stood in the White House Rose Garden and said that heroes don't always wear capes, she was speaking to every one of us who has ever felt too small, too unimportant, or too powerless to make a difference. Here's what I want you to take away from Marcus Washington's incredible journey. Your background doesn't define your potential, your job title doesn't determine your worth, and your voice matters regardless of who's listening. The system only stays broken when good people choose silence over courage. Sometimes the most profound act of rebellion is simply refusing to look away, refusing to accept that things are just the way they are, and refusing to believe that change is someone else's responsibility. If Marcus's story moved you, if it reminded you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, then show your support by hitting that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when you spoke up for someone who couldn't speak for themselves, or share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their voice has power. And if you want to see more stories about real people who change the world by refusing to stay silent, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell, because we're committed to sharing the stories that mainstream media often overlooks. The stories of invisible heroes who prove that justice doesn't require a title. It just requires courage. Your engagement helps us reach more people with these powerful messages. And who knows, the next story we share might be exactly what someone needs to find the courage to act when their moment comes.